Welcome to the General Resonance Theory YouTube channel. Today, we have a presentation by Justin Riddle and Jonathan Schooler on information integration in nested observer windows. We now join this talk already in progress.
Alrighty, nice to talk to you all. So this has been a long journey of me and Jonathan working on this theory. The backstory is I met Jonathan with my interest in just like fractal consciousness type models or ways of thinking about brain activity. And so we just kind of like hit it off chatting about this topic. And then over time, we decided to write a paper together. And now it's been, I think it's been like 3 years. So we submitted the paper once, we're resubmitting now. So it's a work in progress. I think the goal of today's meeting, if you guys are interested, is we're getting close to resubmission. And so I've tried to make these slides and this talk sort of mirror the flow of the manuscript. And so if you have feedback or ideas or things that do or do not make sense or we should clarify, now is the time, and it would be like super helpful. So yeah, without further ado, information integration in nested observer windows, a theory of hierarchical consciousness. So this is a quote that Jonathan pulled out, which I really thought encapsulates some of the ideas, but I'll read this William James quote. "We know what it is to get out of bed on a freezing morning in a room without a fire, and how the very vital principle within us protests against the ordeal. Probably most persons have lain on certain mornings for an hour at a time, unable to brace themselves to the resolve. We think how late we shall be, how the duties of the day will suffer. We say, I must get up, this is ignominious, etc. But still the warm couch feels too delicious, the cold outside too cruel, and resolution faints away and postpones itself again and again. Just as it seemed on the verge of bursting the resistance and passing over into the decisive act." So anyways, this is a quote that I feel summarizes part of William James's contribution to psychology, which is that we are sometimes not the best at even really understanding basic things about our own mind. So we have a situation of a person sitting in bed. I think we can all relate to this, where we really want to get out of bed and do work, but we're just kind of trapped there. So what is it that really where is that divide where our will to get up is sort of conflicted? Maybe there's differing opinions on what you want to do with your day, or you can't work up the resolve. And so what is it that's sort of like pushing back against you? So some of the ideas of hierarchical consciousness.
Just interrupt there for a second. Just one other thing that's kind of cool about this phenomenon, I don't know if other people have this experience, is that you'll keep deciding, okay, I'm gonna get up now, and then you're still there. And then at some point, pop, you do jump out of bed. But it wasn't obvious that anything more happened on all the occasions where it seemed like you were gonna be jumping out of bed and you didn't. So that you also experienced this sort of disconnect between the intention and the action. Or at least I've had that experience.
Yeah, I totally agree. Yeah, you're right, Jonathan. Yeah, there's a couple more sentences that I cut out for like the sake of time, but I should probably add them back in, because that kind of anomalous feeling is also.
I think he has that at the end point where all of a sudden, then boom, you're out of bed.
Up. Yeah. Anyways, okay, I'll try to pause after every slide so you guys can all. All right. So what are some of the things that we're suggesting that you might not sort of intuitively realize about your mind, and how can we sort of provide these some evidence, but also some more simple sort of epiphanies about the state of our minds? So there's this idea that your mind is a monologue, that there's like this narrative self, this singular existence that you have. And yet at the same time, it feels like there's competing ideas, there's different thoughts sort of vying for your attention. And maybe your mind is more like a dialogue or a debate between these different competing cognitive streams, or different ideas of how to interpret events, or different ideas about what you want to do with your day or how you want to spend your time. And so this sort of simplistic notion that you're a monologue, or there's this simple narrative, this narrator in your brain. Maybe it's an oversimplification. Oh, Marissa's coming. Okay, let me see if I can. Oh, don't end the meeting. Dang it. I'm trying, Tam. I'm trying. Oh no. Okay, here we go. Here we go. Welcome, Marissa. All right. Another idea that might be challenged by this model is this idea that you create your thoughts. And so I think we all have this sense of naive sense of ownership of, I thought of that. That was my idea. And you feel like you are sort of the creator of your own thoughts. But then again, it seems like thoughts tend to emerge into our mind fully formed, and we are sort of observers of our thoughts. But can we really say that we understand the origin of our thoughts? You know, sometimes you'll even have an unwanted thought where you think to yourself, oh, I couldn't possibly have thought that. And so then you suppress and like dismiss that thought. So it appears like there's a little bit more going on than just you're sitting there at the helm creating all of these ideas. And then another idea is that we are totally in control of our body. And so this is something that William James quote kind of sums up, is that, you know, you want to get out of bed and then suddenly you're out of bed, and maybe there's like a skip in the chain of causal command there. And so what degree do we really control our body, and at what point are we sort of along for the ride versus providing meaningful input? And I do think we are providing meaningful input into our actions and into our lives.
So on this slide, shall I wait to comment, or do you want some comments now?
No, you can comment now. Yeah.
Yes, a couple of thoughts. I mean, as you know, obviously, I'm very sympathetic to the idea of nested consciousness and levels of consciousness. I agree fully. Your mind is a dialogue in that view, where you have different parts of yourself that comprise the whole. I know you're trying to summarize complex ideas in very simple bullet points here, but I would suggest number 2 and 3 could maybe use a bit more nuance, in that in my view, for what it's worth, the process of thoughts emerging or being created is a nested process, but it's not that they always just emerge fully formed to and presented to your dominant consciousness. There is a kind of a radial process, a give and take, I think, to add one more level of kind of causal distinction there. And then similarly, in controlling your bodily functions, which are of course varied to a great degree, like me using my hand right now to emphasize what I'm speaking about, is quite a conscious thing. Whereas my breathing or my growing my hairs in my arms obviously is totally unconscious for the most part, whereas breath can become conscious. So I think it's important to stress that kind of circular or radial causality between different nested levels of consciousness. And the term hierarchical, one final comment, I think in many readers may give the impression you're suggesting there is a top dominating consciousness that somehow imposes its will downwards, or the opposite, where the bottom imposes will upwards, where I think the term holarchical, or less awkwardly, just nested consciousness, I think maybe conveys what you're trying to suggest a little more fully, and that it's not meant to be either top down or bottom up, but kind of this more complex gestalt. Is that more accurate?
Yeah, I definitely, so the next slide, we'll dive into it. But yeah, the idea is that, there's these nested observers within your mind or within your body. And you are definitely one of those observers. So it's not to say that you don't have agency within your sort of specified domain. So yeah, I do think there is a creative act within our minds and volitional control within our minds. But yeah, there's a dynamic sort of bottom-up process and top-down process where the information coming into our brains into our minds from the bottom up appears to sort of emerge into our minds, and we have some construction that we can apply at that phase or at that abstract level. And then our top-down control, I'll get into this at like a little bit later, but the idea that you're really only in control of like one level beneath yourself, and when you're trying to control, multi-levels beyond your sort of frame of reference, it kind of escapes you. So yeah, and then in the paper, we're clear to define hierarchy not in the strict sense where the top is entirely in control of the lower levels, but that it's more collaborative with semi-autonomous levels on the way down. Although I'm probably going to stay away from the word holarchy, just because I don't know, I don't want to dive into holograms and all that jazz. But I definitely vibe with it. But yeah, I don't think I want to come out with the word holarchy.
Yeah, nested is definitely good, and that's definitely the one that we're pushing. Also, I think one interesting thing, I think the hands actually is a little bit more nuanced than that. I think when people are talking, their hands are kind of almost doing their own thing. And I would not be at all surprised if people really didn't even exactly know what their hand was going to be doing next. The hand is essentially just its own system, which is mirroring and vibing with the gist of of what's being said. Certainly, when I speak, I don't have any like willful. Okay, now raise your hands over your head. Now, then I just did, obviously, but that like they really do kind of have a mind of their own.
Yeah, I think just to respond to that real quickly, I think it is kind of both and, where oftentimes they can be kind of doing their own thing, but as I'm speaking right now, I'm constantly not using my hands to speak.
Right.
Whereas I could be doing it, and I'm choosing not to make a point.
Yeah.
So I think it's kind of like breathing, where it generally is fairly autonomous, but you can then step into the conscious and make them,
yeah, I think breathing is a really good example. Yeah.
Yeah. And one other thing, I think we're on the same page on this, Justin, because it's definitely in the paper, where it does seem like sometimes, like particularly say, I imagine a surgeon who's doing an operation, or a baseball player who's focusing on the ball, where the you actually sort of zooms down to a lower level window. There is there's no abstract thought about, or you're just like really in that lower level window, and that may be in part why time goes slower, because you're actually just you've dropped down.
Yeah, I totally hear you. I feel like that is the biggest struggle with this paper is actually pinning the concept of you to anything here.
It's all you.
Yeah, I totally hear you. And like after our conversations, Jonathan, like one thing which I'll pitch in the talk in a little bit is like this idea of speeding up or slowing down time. And I went with like the simplest possible model because I personally also agree that like you can zoom in, but then what is that really in a way? Anyways, well,
another possibility would be something like global workspace or something like that, or attention or experience or something. Global workspace might even be it. I'm not sure. We can carry on with this. It's possible that we could avoid you and focus more on something like phenomenal experience or something.
Yeah, I think there's a way we could spin it where like we just never mention you, even though I feel like poetically it has a lot more impact, in the writing.
Yeah.
Like like writing in the second person. But yeah, another way to avoid it, is just talk about consciousness and then never specify like you are the one at the top. Because I think in the newest version, I just say like you're the apex of the hierarchy. there could be autonomous beings all the way down the hierarchy, right? There's like, autonomous consciousness existing down the chain.
Yeah.
Or, and that would be like the pure like panpsychist, kind of GRT model.
Yeah.
Or there's some emergent level, like maybe only the highest level, the global, the most global workspace attains consciousness, and then that's you. Or there's like a threshold where once you reach a threshold, then those higher levels are conscious. So
Another way, a thing that just occurred to me now is that that you could always be at the top level, but the transparency of the lower level tiles could vary. So you can kind of, like when you're looking at that baseball, the region with the baseball becomes really transparent, and you're able to really sort of see down, maybe even a couple levels, something like that.
Yeah, I like that. It'd be like the cross frequency coupling is so strong that it like reaches like synchrony levels of like merging with the lower.
Yeah.
Well, coming at this go ahead. Did you want to
just
go
quickly, do you talk about the flow state at all? Because you definitely disappear when you're in a flow state, deeply immersed in whatever it is. And it might be that's something that most people can relate to, and it might be worth a mention. Just thought I'd say that.
Well, it depends what you mean by you. I definitely agree that the sort of the sense of self per se kind of disappears, but experience is still there's still a ongoing phenomenal stream of consciousness.
Yeah, I guess a real quick comment there. I know we were talking a lot on this first slide already. I would suggest that the time consciousness is narrowed to a much finer point in flow states. There is still a center of perception, whereas in a normal waking anxious consciousness, we are thinking about the past and worried about the future, and that's what gives rise to that kind of anxious normal state of awareness, whereas it kind of becomes a more positive pinpoint of focus during flow states.
Yeah, I feel like when I'm in a flow state, I'm like almost the most conscious in like a weird way, but I don't know.
most in the present, yeah. Nikki, you had a comment?
I was just going to throw in, coming at this from a transpersonal perspective, you have the smaller self in terms of the you versus sort of a self-realization with a capital S. So sort of merging with the primary process, staying raw and filtered consciousness and feeling the unification with, multiple beings and the all. So something to throw in.
I agree. I mean, oh, sorry, Jonathan. Yeah.
I was just going to say, I've used this slide and then had like a question mark, because it suggests that we ourselves could kind of be tiles in yet a larger.
Exactly. For sure.
Window. Yeah. And but critically, that window could itself be a tile in yet a larger window. So never get to never assume you're necessarily the top
cosmic consciousness.
The top dog.
Yes, I agree.
Yeah, so those moments where you have like a collective experience, which I've feel like I've totally had those bizarre moments where you really kind of like merge with a group in kind of an altered state. Yeah, I wonder if that is akin to the transparency with the lower levels, where only rarely are you really able to like tap into those lower levels and the higher levels. But most of the time we're just like in this slice of time. We have like this narrow frequency band that we operate in, and it's mostly a bunch of like chaotic dialogue and debates and minimal control. Yeah.
Couldn't you say that when you zoom all the way up to like the collective level, that fits on the same axis as your sort of attention level of like your whole body, and then there's your arm that's manipulating the tool, and then there's like you feel the world through the tool, and it's like there's these layers of transparency and opacity depending on where you're focusing your attention. And you could even extend that all the way up past yourself towards that sense of group or communion with others.
Yeah, Jonathan and I have even speculated of calling this just like the attention window. Like the highest window is just like this moving attention window. But yeah, it like when you start to like hack out the details of that, it's like, wait, so there's only one region that's paying attention, and then what happens when it hooks up with another region? Yeah, it got like somewhat convoluted from like the focus on attention itself in a weird way.
Yeah, in altered states, I've kind of seen this in terms of like, the light microscope and the level of resolution and kind of going in and out, So yeah, pretty cool.
Yeah, we're still like trying to find like a nice artistic picture to go along with this. I'm trying to be artsy, but my attempts have failed so far. This is all right, I'm going to go to the next slide. Yeah, it's good that this is generating such, I don't know, thought and interest. So one thing that this paper is mostly about is like this lingua franca, which the GRT model, I think, sells it pretty well. This idea that electrical activity could be like the great unifier of the scales. And so if we can have sort of a single way to carry and transmit information, this would be really useful for interdisciplinary study, right? So there's people investigating entire brain nuclei, and then there's people investigating individual neurons and circuits, and then there's people doing proteins and protein pathways. And the struggle is like, we're not even using the same terminology, we're using different tools and methods. But yeah, one thing that a true hierarchical consciousness would require is it would need like one medium for information exchange. Otherwise, you'd be doing all these transformations like, oh, okay, we're communicating with chemicals. Now we got to switch it over to like, action potentials. Now we got to switch it over to like low frequency electric fields. And maybe there's like a way to pull that off. But yeah, if it was all just electrical activity, that would be quite easy.
Sorry to slow down your flow here, but yeah, it's super
great.
interesting, your comments about electrical information pathways as a possible unifier. And we actually are finishing or wrapping up a first draft paper, number of the people on the call here, and that paper looking at ways to use various synchrony indexes to more easily quantify those information pathways as kind of a shortcut, because obviously quantifying the actual electrical information or EM field information is all but impossible. But you can use synchrony indexes to approximate, in many cases, the primary information flows. But in terms of going from like electrochemical to electrical or EM field more generally, I wonder if you will lose a lot of information there. So just a consideration moving ahead, I think certainly we could look to it as kind of a first stage simplifying heuristic for quantifying information flows, but I'd be cautious in making it too simple.
Yeah, I'd be curious what you're gaining by adding the word, electrochemical versus electromagnetic. You know what I mean?
Well,
like a lot of for example, proteins transmit like electrons between each other, and so a lot of like binding is really just this like transmission of like electron flows. So I don't know, I think part of the disconnect is like it's easy to imagine nuclei and neurons as having like a similar language to each other, but then once you hit protein level, suddenly it feels like there's something different going on. And we've kind of dropped this from the paper, but we used to dive in a lot more. But the study of like protein dynamics is very limited right now, and most techniques that we've used historically are you pull the protein out of its environment and you like crystallize it, freeze it, shoot X-rays at it. You can get the structure of it, but we have very limited understanding of like the actual dynamics for how proteins like bind and stuff. Or even just like their own folding. So I think there's room for there to be like an electrical dynamic description of a protein, which is compatible, but we've like dropped that attempt from the paper because I think that's part of why it just got too complicated.
It is complicated, yeah. And
yeah.
Colin, feel free to chime in on this, but a quick follow-up comment. Quantifying electrochemical flows, which are usually how we describe, obviously synaptic information flows, axonal information flows. I guess the difference is, obviously they are all ultimately EM field effects, right? But the question is, at what level can you characterize those dynamics in a way that is accurate and empirically tractable, right? And so if you're looking at the, flow of the potential down an axon and across the synapse through the vesicles, crossing the synapse, it does get very tricky in terms of what you're actually quantifying. And so that's where I think if you're looking at the more global, let's say medium scale and global scale EM field effects and quantifying those using synchrony indexes, you can kind of ignore, it seems pretty legitimately, the actual electrochemical information flows to some degree. You'll lose something, of course, through that simplification. But if you really are trying to quantify that neuronal level of information flows, you might lose too much by looking just to more traditional electrical or EM field effects. Colin, you want to chime in on that?
I could, but I could just go on and on for hours. All I'd like to say is that Marissa and I have the remnants of the paper we all started in review at the moment. And the main thrust of that article is that the thing is entirely EM fields from the atomic level up. Everything electrochemical, chemical, all of it is actually electromagnetism. There are one or two exceptions in the gravitational field and space, but at the superatomic level, it's all EM. So there is a unifying principle to be had that you can argue for, but beyond that, I could go on, and I'd rather not for the moment. So I'll leave it there.
Nice, Colin. Yeah, I'd be down to check out that paper if it's.
I'll send you the the intermediate, not for distribution draft, if you like, if that's okay with Marissa. Yeah. Is that okay, Marissa? Yeah. Terrific.
Oh yeah, for sure.
Cool. Okay, next slide. So yeah, I think this is part that hasn't really changed much, and you're probably already seen this before, but the basic idea of the now model is there's 3 principles where, forgo discussion of what it is generating these signals. But the idea would be that synchrony, this idea of near zero phase lag coherence, aka synchrony, is a way of forming an observer window. And this is the primary unit of information integration. And I'll go through them all, and then I'll go through them again. Coherence is the way that multiple observer windows within the same level can share information with each other laterally. So within a spatial temporal level, they're sort of weakly coupled and sharing information. And then finally, cross-frequency coupling is this mechanism for bottom-up and top-down information sharing across spatial temporal levels. And this is basically enabled by the nested nature of the observer windows. And synchrony, like kind of importantly, is the only strong form of coupling. And so we argue that this really sets like the boundary for what becomes an observer window. And then coherence and cross-frequency coupling are weaker forms of coupling, where once observer windows are established, they can then communicate or share information. And I'll go through this more in a second. But
I guess I'm not saying the distinction between synchrony and coherence here. Is it just a matter of degree?
Yeah, so synchrony is a near zero phase lag. So we have like some equations which are more or less like a simplification or like a way to like verify, the kind of pattern of the signals. So you'll notice that the top one is just like the equation for a correlation. But so if you had 2 signals A and B that were in a single observer window, they would be same frequency, zero phase lag. They're essentially like becoming the same thing. So I think when we think about, what makes a thing one thing versus multiple things, something, or we getting lost in my things. To define a single thing, it would have to have a really high degree of coupling where everything is sort of moving in this sort of 100% synced up manner. And then each of these observer windows has sort of a given frequency signature, which we're suggesting is the integration rate of that observer window. So examples would be like a neuron, right? So it doesn't just like come for free, but you've sort of created with this biological infrastructure, you've created the conditions for making a single highly synchronized entity where everything within that entity has near perfect correlation with each other. Versus coherence is a necessarily non-zero phase lag. So there's sort of a delay time between them syncing up with each other. So I'll give an example in a bit, but it's in like EEG analysis, we use this metric called weighted phase lag index or phase lag index, where genuinely communicating regions in the brain will not have perfect correlation, but there'll be like a set delay where the signal has to get transmitted from one to the other. And so there's actually ways of sort of distinguishing with your coupling metrics, whether or not it's like true synchrony or it's just like coherence. Yeah. So here depicted are two different spatial temporal scales, and the observer windows are depicted by like ovals. And then you'll have, the definition of those ovals defined by synchrony. And then coherence between two ovals will be this sort of transient, functional, dynamic networks of observer windows communicating with each other. And then cross-frequency coupling is when you have nested within a region, you have signals finding their way into the larger, slower observer window, or vice versa. The larger, slower observer window can then guide the activity of faster, smaller observer windows.
And real quick, so with synchrony at near zero phase lag, have you thought at all about like Bose condensates and maybe what is defining an observer window is in fact kind of an achieving of something like a Bose condensate, where really there's maybe for all practical purposes a zero phase lag? Some people have stated this and speculated about this kind of possibility already, not just me.
Yeah, I love that comment, Tam. Yeah, I spent a lot of the last 2 weeks thinking about Bose-Einstein condensates because I also have a quantum consciousness podcast. But I think it's really interesting. I would love if there's quantum effects in the brain and somehow there's like these networks of really tightly coupled systems where you can reach I think an important question is, and we definitely don't go into this in the paper, but where is that threshold for where synchrony is like genuinely achieved? One argument would be like it needs to be like quantum coherence, right? Like this like truly smearing of like a wave function across multiple particles, and then you have like true synchrony where like maybe quantum mechanics is like the line between synchrony and coherence, where coherence would be any sort of like classical synchronization, and then true synchrony would be like some sort of like quantum coherent, like quantum computational level. But I mean, no way am I going into that in this paper. And then also like, who knows? Maybe you need something like that. Maybe you don't. But
cool.
Yeah, I'm kind of a believer in the coming quantum computational revolution, and that synchrony will somehow be like, synchrony will be able to do quantum computation, and coherence will be like the classical form of coupling between quantum computers. But wow, yeah, we're really off base here, but I love it.
Happy to oblige.
Thank you. And there's also arguments that maybe Bose-Einstein condensation, like is not as computationally plausible, and so you'd want room temperature, other forms of like quantum computation that could come out, not linked to like Bose-Einstein condensation necessarily, but yeah, that's like a whole other topic. So other comments on this?
The chips I want to build will allow some empirical exploration of the classical EM concepts of synchrony and coherence.
That would be really interesting.
One of the major missions. We have to start somewhere, and that's the place I'm hoping to do. Just one, two resonating fields interacting with each other. Just one next year. Really big, like 15 centimeters by 15 centimeters, massive, clunky, classical interaction. And I may have a little story about coherence and synchrony in that. So
cool. Yeah, I think the synchrony coherence distinction is something that I think this paper has been so slow in the works because we've really tried to like get these ideas right. And so like this notion of like binding by synchrony, it's like this strong form of integration, but then communication through coherence, it's really just a form of sharing information and not at that full strong level. And I think there's ways of explicitly quantifying this difference. And I mean, I think this could be a pretty genuine novel approach that the now model gives you, is like really drawing a line between those two. Like, you know, if something is truly able to integrate information, it has to have this more like pure form of synchrony.
Hey, Justin, can you remind me, we used to have synchrony and coherence the other way around, and then somebody straightened us out.
Yeah, I don't remember exactly who straightened us out, but it was like a really hilarious epiphany where it was like, I was saying binding by synchrony, but here we're calling it coherence, and then communication through coherence, but here we're calling it synchrony. Like I was literally like directly misusing the terms like in the text. I think some physicists straightened us out. Maybe it was Colin or something. I don't even know. But
well, in your defense, Justin, these terms are used differently by different people, you know, and
exactly.
I generally equate synchrony and coherence as just different names for largely the same constellation of phenomena. But it's important, like you're doing here, to just define them as how you're using them. And just one final comment, and I'm always wary of what is a natural continuum being divided into what appear to be discrete phenomena when it really is a natural continuum, and therefore you're reifying those things as phenomena that are in fact not discrete, but they are continuous. So by giving it a name that's different, I think you risk reifying something that's not really reifiable.
Yeah, excellent point, Tam. I think your original question tapped into my draw towards coherence is quantum coherence and my associations with that, being obsessed with that whole world. Where if you had this quantum classical divide, I mean, that would be a true divide, not. Well,
I mean, even that's obviously way beyond today, so I'll leave it at that. But is that even really? I mean, it's traditionally considered to be the cut, but that's been a major problem with QM for decades. Is there really a divide there? You know, or again, is
so
it?
My conjecture is that there is it may even not, that it's not near zero, it's actually zero.
It literally is zero. Yeah,
literally zero. And there is an incredible difference between zero phase lag and anything more than zero phase lag. So you really have a difference there. And
I like that. I could just delete the word near.
And in that context, and this is, I think, is pretty close to, you know, some of the things in GRT. That's what makes binding, is when it's truly, the experience is when it's truly zero. So that's my my 2 bits.
Could I offer a you know, the duck rabbit illusion?
I love the duck rabbit illusion.
Well, it's pretty old now, but would you say, my intuition is that the synchrony moment would be when the duck converts to the rabbit and the rabbit converts to the duck. And the coherence aspect is that the same experience is being had, in literally that the image that's presented to you is continuous. It's the same image. And yet our interpretation of it goes through these momentary competing interpretations. And that could be those synchrony moments at a very high level operating. That might be one of the stories that are underpinned in this conception of the dynamics. So I thought I'd mention that. I don't know what you feel about that, but I'll leave you to it.
I was just going to say, I have to think about that. I would love, I'm not able to fully run it in my mind as you said it just then, but I would love to, I'm going to think about that, because there definitely is a way in which it just like, it doesn't just sort of gradually go from duck to rabbit. It freaking pops. It just
there is
snaps
no
from
transition. Yeah.
it just snaps from the one to the other. So it's as if basically I actually think that what may be going on is you've got two nested observer windows. One window which is experiencing the duck, and another that's experiencing the rabbit, and somehow attention is, and again, we have a little bit of issue with exactly how this part of the model works, but you're somehow snapping, you're experiencing one nested observer window, and then you're experiencing the other nested observer window, and the two windows are each one having their coherent synchronized experience, and they may be synchronizing stuff where they're through cross-frequency coupling, integrating all the lower level edges and components and so on. So I think it's a lovely test case for trying to think of articulating how does that experience relate to this model. I think is a really good point, and we kind of touch on that a little bit in later parts in the paper.
Has anyone actually looked at that as a perceptual process, as like the illusion of like the, because you can kind of, I'm reminded of those similar illusion, visual illusion type, like, I don't know if they're generated, computer generated, but like where you see the foreground and the background, and like there's that intersection where you can kind of see both, and then you're like, you can kind of go back and forth. And I'm wondering if, in the same way that we were looking for like backward masking tasks or any other sort of perceptual tasks that are really concretely defined, that this might be one, actually. Like if anyone has done this or maybe not, and that's really novel.
There's been a lot of research on a related phenomenon of binocular rivalry.
Right.
Two different images presented to the two eyes,
right,
and it flips like very abruptly from the one interpretation to the other. Actually, what's his name? Koch did a bunch of research on that.
Yep.
And there's also been research looking at other sorts of bistable images like Necker cubes. And I mean, the nice thing about them, of course, is that it's the exact same input that's happening in all cases, and you're just flipping your phenomenal experience. So it's a really nice paradigm for exploring these things, and there definitely is some research on it, but not as much as could be. And there's also some cool stuff that, for example, creative individuals, they flip between bistable images more quickly. And there's even one study which we tried to get, but we were unable to get, where practicing flipping images, like practicing flipping a Necker cube, actually facilitated creative processes. So it's definitely been an area that I've wanted to go spend more time on.
It'd be really interesting, I think, to do some high definition EEG imaging of subjects as they perceive the rabbit, duck illusion and other things like Necker cubes, because I bet there's a different pattern displayed in the brain, and I bet it is a bistable pattern in the brain.
Exactly.
That reflects the perception, the sensory perception. That'll be part of the kind of the resonome fleshing out process we're looking to do as part of GRT.
Yeah, it'd be really cool. Yeah, I think the idea of synchrony and like being locked into just like one sort of view and trying to flip it. Yeah, it's pretty relevant. Cool, next slide. Speaking of visual perception, so one consequence of synchrony is that you're going to be intrinsically tied to some frequency range. And so we propose that if you take an example like visual cortex, it has a prominent 10 hertz, roughly 10 hertz rhythm called the alpha rhythm. And there's been a number of experiments looking at sort of discrete intervals of integration. And so, yeah, we propose that the observer windows are sort of opening up a period of time where you're going to be sensitive to input, and then all the information acquired in this time frame become integrated into a single gestalt perception. And so this is really like the binding by synchrony, but then sort of temporally extending it a little bit, which is maybe already implicit in the binding by synchrony. And so one example of this is the flicker fusion rate. So if you present two lights flashing very quickly together, there you hit a point where the lights become so close together that they fuse into a single flash. And there was this really cool study not even that long ago showing that individuals' rhythm and visual cortex was predictive of their flicker fusion rate, sort of suggesting that every alpha rhythm, there's sort of a new gestalt perception that's created. And if you can get both of the flashes into two different gestalt windows or two observer windows, then you have a discrete experience of having two separate flashes of light. But then if they are perhaps within the same observer window, then they get bound into a single gestalt, and then that information of the flicker is lost and you have a fusion. Intentional pause. All right, and I think there's a number of, this is like a simple optical illusion. There's kind of a sweet spot if you get closer to your monitor, but if you're looking at the blue dot in your peripheral vision, you'll start to see a flicker. And presumably this is also correlated with your alpha rhythm, where you can kind of become self-aware of the rate at which your visual cortex is flickering. And so the point really here is like your brain is oscillating. Yeah, right. So your brain it has all these oscillations, but it seems really intrinsically linked to our conscious awareness and our experience. And there's been this big debate going on in the field that all of perception is really discrete. This is kind of the same epiphany that physics had with quantum physics, where you're quantizing a previously continuous reality into chunks. And so I think synchrony and the observer window fits nicely within this sort of emerging paradigm of focusing on neural oscillations, viewing cognition as being discrete. And a lot of my work has been really interested in decision making and sort of the more volitional, action-oriented side of cognition, and looking at the discretization of our action generation and of our like decision making process. So more on that in my future, but comments here?
Are you going to mention about the continuous, relating that to the continuous nature of experience?
Good point. Yeah, I don't have a slide on that, but yeah. So then one question is, why do we have this perception of having like a narrative flow or a continuous evolution of events? And one idea is that coming from predictive coding, that these observer windows are not necessarily generating reality, but that the way the brain works is that it has a working model of reality. And then every flicker or every refresh, you're getting a model update. And so it's not that you have to create everything from scratch, constantly, but you have a model of the world. And that according to predictive coding, most activity that you observe in the brain is actually error signals. It's sort of deviations from the prediction. So I have a prediction of what I'm going to see next. If something surprises me, I need to process that surprising information, but I don't need to process just like I've been sitting here for the last 45 minutes. All that data is sort of locked into the model, and only the updates, the changes, are what needs to be altered, or that's what like brain activity corresponds to. So then the idea is that our conscious experience might sort of be equivalent to that internalized model, and that sort of provides the continuity between moments. But yeah, this is also another concept we kind of struggle with, right? Where it's like, is it truly, you hear these stories of these like Buddhist monks where they like tap into primal experience, and then like they realize all of their life is these like discrete moments of consciousness. I mean, whether or not you buy into that or not, I don't know. So we kind of straddle both worlds where, yeah, there's these gestalts that are being created in a rhythmic pattern, but there's room for a predictive model to be in play that sort of gives the continuity as well.
Or the other option, I think, too, is these rostral to caudal waves continually washing over the brain. So there's one, in the gamma range. There's one in the theta range as well. So I think that's how
interesting.
Persinger, yeah, that's how Persinger kind of looks at it too, as a refresh rate for these frames of temporal experience.
Yeah, the traveling waves. Yeah.
Uh-huh.
Name for this illusion? Is there a name for this illusion?
Oh, this one right here. Oh God, I think this Van Rulen paper here is a review. One of these two, and yeah, I found a Van Rulen, like I think a Tix review or one of his reviews. But he actually has a study where they correlate. I don't even know how they did this, but they somehow like tried to quantify what people saw the flickering at, and then their like actual like alpha rhythm. And tried to provide some evidence that it was actually like the same. So I mean, checks it out theoretically. But. Okay, time perception. So you're driving down the road, a truck changes lanes into your second to slam on the brake, slows down, and you have an ample opportunity to make a course correction. So how do we explain the slowing down of time at our impending death? So we went back and forth a lot, but for the paper, I think what I'm going to go with is that maybe these observer windows have a flexible integration rate. So if you're, let's just go with the global workspace model, you are the apex of the hierarchy. That apex, that global workspace, has a flicker rate, and then at those moments where your life is threatened, it ramps up the speed of its processing in order to have coherence with these lower order processes. So you have all these nested observers. Presumably there's observer windows controlling your arms and your legs, and those are operating at this much faster frequency. You need to get your like conscious mind level onto this really fast rhythm. And so it somehow shifts its integration rates way quicker. And you get this sense of dilating time as you experience more of these frames per second. And then the alternate example, before we get comments, is that in the case of mind wandering, you'll have these experiences where you're diving into very abstract thought. Maybe you're reading a book in the forest, like this picture here. And as you sort of dive into the concept in this novel or the scenery that you're in, you sink into really abstract thought, and that global workspace observer window for your mind slows down. And then time ironically speeds up, where suddenly you've spent an hour in the forest and you've had very abstract, dream-like patterns of thought. And yeah, but time has sort of flown by. So the
I
idea
actually-
here would be, oh, yep.
I was just gonna say, I made a comment about this in the paper that I shared with you. Yeah, I think it'd be actually really interesting to vary people's, either like really zooming in on some low level sensory experience or zooming back on some abstract thought and look at their subjective experience of time, because it does kind of make sense that I would seem to go faster. You could really show this empirically.
Yeah, that'd be really cool. And then to add some neuroimaging, right? Some EEG or something, and just like see like if this works on subjective experience, you could use this as like an anchor point to then look at the brain and say what is tracking with subjective experience. You know?
Yeah.
That could be really
Hasn't
cool.
Eagleman done quite a bit of work on this kind of thing?
Yeah.
Attempted work.
Attempted to, okay.
Yeah. So he did the famous bungee cord study, which didn't really find, I think it didn't find what he was looking for, and certainly not what we would have liked to have seen. So you would like to see that when people are doing the bungee cord, that their ability to make temporal discriminations is better than when they're on the bridge. And he didn't find that. And we did a study too, where we did, I wasted a graduate student, like 2 years of graduate student's career on this one. There's a looming effect where things loom at you and time seems to go slower. And so the idea was that people's temporal discrimination when things loomed at them would be better than when it went away from them. And we didn't get that effect either. But somebody else, what's his name? The guy in England, it's in the paper now. He's the one who does free will stuff. And
oh, Libet?
No, not Libet. I want to say Patrick. Anyhow, there's somebody who has gotten changes in changes in experience time being associated with changes in objective metrics of temporal discrimination.
That was a study where they were like paying attention to
Patrick Haggard.
Okay, yeah, that'd be fun.
One of the authors on that.
Anyways, yeah, so the pitch here is the integration rate is flexible, and I think there is like a lot of emerging research, some my own, like just talking about how there's rhythms that can speed up or slow down based on like demands. One of them is like this visual task where performance is better if you can like discriminate time better, and then another one where performance is better if you're able to blur time and compare things or something. And they actually show the alpha rhythm in visual cortex is able to shift up or down by about 2 hertz depending on the task demands. So yeah, I mean that's not really commenting on the subjective experience, but theoretically, if visual alpha is like an example observer window, there is some evidence that it can move up and down in the frequency domain, at least slightly.
It would be interesting to see if, and this is kind of implied by the temporal binding, no, what is it called? The flat flicker fusion result. Yeah. But it would be interesting to see that alpha rate was correlated with time perception.
Yeah, that would be interesting. Yeah.
Subjective experience of time.
Yeah. All righty, move on to the next one. So yeah, one transformation of this presentation is that we've kind of like tied the consciousness implications at the end of each of the principles. So I think keeps it interesting. So the pitch, I kind of already talked about this, but the difference between coherence and synchrony, one example that can kind of hits home for us, at least when we were first thinking about this, is if you're really vibing out with another person, you have a very productive conversation, they're talking, you're talking, there's a coherence, sort of an ebb and flow where they take a turn, you take a turn, and the conversation emerges. And so if you were to measure, auditory signals between the two individuals, you would find a high degree of non-zero coherence between, the speech patterns of the two individuals. There's some sort of phase offset between the two, but you wouldn't want to find perfect synchrony between the two having the conversation, because that would just be a single voice, right? If you had like two microphones in the same room, you'd find near perfect correlation in the voices. That would just be one voice, right? So when two people have a conversation, they don't suddenly merge into a single individual, typically. And so that's for you, Nikki. But this is kind of demonstrating the difference between coherence and synchrony, right? There's you keep your autonomy, but you can still have a productive, meaningful, lateral share of information. And this is really pioneered by Pascal Fries, who kind of made neural oscillations a thing in the past 20 years. And he called it communication through coherence, where you can have different regions here conceptualized as observer windows. Say you have this higher order region in red, which is processing more motion, spatial related information, and then a more ventral region in yellow, processing more color and feature related information. If you have attention focused towards location, then you might have an increase in coherence between the visual region, which gets all the raw data, and then this observer window specializing in spatial information. And so you'd see coherence between those two, but not the other two. And then the information is sort of transferred down a certain pathway, more so than the other. So the idea here is there's, sort of a locked in synaptic framework, but coherence, you can really form these dynamic functional networks, which can be transiently engaged and have a lot of flex, might tie into like cognitive flexibility and kind of get us able to change where information is routed based on context, beyond just sort of some automated pathway. Probably review for a lot of you. Favorite examples, we'll just breeze through this, is this group Hanselmeyer in the UK, where he presents people with audio and visual snippets, and he presents them so that the brain activity is perfectly synced up. And then what you see is that people have improved memory for the experience if they're both presented in theta frequency and they're sort of coherently lined up with each other. So your memory of this thing is stronger, presumably because the hippocampus has a very prominent theta rhythm, which is sort of like the seat of memory encoding and binding. And so the information can more effectively get transmitted there to be bound. And one other implication here is that there's so many aspects of our body which have these sort of intrinsic carrier frequencies associated with them. And then to finalize, the evidence in the study, they found that there was coherence between the visual source of information and the auditory source of information. And that coherence was stronger when you had more successful memory encoding. So I think it's pretty straightforward demonstration that communication through coherence can lead to changes in what gets bound into memory.
And also on that, Justin, we've had some meetings in the past, as you probably recall, where we looked at Buzaki and Bagura and Benjamin, and they all also talk about theta being a carrier frequency that may act as kind of the backbone for gamma band syntactic units for perception, memory formation, et cetera, which to me is really intriguing. It's kind of like we're fleshing out the syntax of the brain itself, through that EEG dissection.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, next slide, right on that. So no matter what language you look at, seemingly very, diverse origins evolutionarily, all language sort of has this shared carrier frequency around theta. So no matter if you're speaking Swedish, Chinese, or American English, the speech envelope has a prominent theta rhythm component to it. And also your eyes are moving around this same frequency. So it seems like a lot of sensory input is sort of coming in at like a key frequency. And so these regions are all dedicated to processing these different types of information. This is really like a primed way of being able to flexibly route information around if two things needed to be connected. Cool. And then for consciousness, one thing I like to think about is this idea of cognitive streams. So you still have these semi-autonomous brain regions or observer windows, but they're sharing information with each other. And so what would it be like to be an observer window engaging in this communication through coherence? Maybe it would, and this is a little bit poetic or whatever, but maybe it would be sort of like this movie, Inside Out by Pixar, where you have these different personalities sort of fighting it out. We like to think of the brain as this cooperative, shared enterprise, but there's also examples where different parts of the brain might be sort of communicating ineffectively, or they have a desire which is not getting manifest in the body, and what would that look like? And another example that I really like is Richard Schwartz has this idea of an internal family systems model for psychotherapy, where he would do psychotherapy on families. And he found that his approach to psychotherapy for the family unit actually was really applicable to the individual. And he started to conceptualize the individual as having sort of a family of different personalities, competing ideas, and perceptions, and framing psychiatric illness as sort of a disagreement between family members within your own mind. And so maybe coherence would be some metric for how effectively these semi-autonomous sub-windows are communicating with each other. So yeah, I don't know how hard science I can get at this moment, but comments.
Well, I find it really interesting that all languages have the same essential theta rhythm. And I think I've also seen some research on babies that seem to have a similar, I guess, ability to perceive, or their babbling. I think even their babbling reflects certain rhythms. I forget exactly what it was, but kind of mirroring this. And one final comment, I don't know if this is just coincidence, but I doubt it is. You probably know that the basic Schumann resonance, the basic geomagnetic field resonance of the planet is 7.8.
I was gonna say, cool.
So it's exactly the same. Probably not.
Wow, it's right at 7.8 hertz.
Yeah.
Okay, you blow my mind.
Yeah, and Persinger talks about this as potentially like storage for everything that's going on. Yeah, in the ionosphere.
Resonate with the noosphere.
The noosphere. Yeah.
Yeah. The electromagnetic field of the Earth is like storing up.
Yes.
Sort of makes sense. If I was a brain, I wouldn't want to fight that particular frequency 24/7.
Exactly right. Yeah, you by necessity.
Yeah, you'd want to tap into it. Yeah.
Especially if you look at the evolution of brains, beginning with single cell organisms, they're going to be buffeted by those strong forces, and of course we evolved from those creatures through the course of billions of years. So it's no surprise we mirror the background field rhythms.
I thought of another way to say this whole cognitive stream thing. So just as you want like this cognitive flexibility with these like routable, coherent, functional dynamic networks, you'd think that, evolutionarily, you'd want to evolve like a diversity of like opinions almost within the same brain, right? If your brain always came up with like the same opinion, maybe we'd be much less effective. You'd want to like cultivate this debate or cultivate this this dialogue. So yeah, I don't know. Any reactions to this slide? Maybe I'm like pushing it, but yeah, we always think about like coherence as like, just like a linear like transmission, right? Almost like a radio signal. going from point A to point B. But what if it's more like a dialogue? I don't know. Maybe I'm like getting poetic and there's not really evidence for this, but
I think the dialogue, I like the dialogue. The only thing that I think is that it's both a dialogue, but it's also the looking at the lower levels, the pixels within pixels within pixels. So it's both sort of crosstalk and then but also upward downward.
yeah, that's a really good point. Yeah, I think in the paper I'm trying to like have like a fun consciousness moment every section to like keep the reader interested. But yeah, I totally agree. Like there's no reason that the cognitive stream would be limited to just like one level.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree with that. And it's the vertical level, I think, that is a bit more mysterious and a bit more interesting. Because with kind of like the flat horizontal level, it's like, okay, you just have these kind of coherence processes, synchrony processes, information gets shared. But when you're talking about between different hierarchies in the system, and then like, how does that work in the coherence principle? I mean, there's stuff out there with cross-frequency coupling where you have this kind of like Russian doll nesting of synchronized octaves. But that to me is where it gets more difficult, and solving that problem, that's the real meat of the problem, not just the horizontal.
Yeah, I hear you. I was drawing on the whiteboard the other day, and like, imagine each of these brain regions has a like complex network of nested information flowing into it. I think the lateral transfer of these like apexes would be much more interesting and dynamic, right? Because like if you're the apex of like independent holarchies or hierarchies with all this like mystery pumping into the highest level, you would be the highest level communicating with another higher level, and then assume there's like not even much crosstalk between those hierarchies. I think it would lead to a much more dynamic view where it would be almost more like a personality than just like a I don't know, than the simple lateral transfer. But I totally hear you, Ryan, because yeah, that was like, yeah, this is probably the most awkward thing to like plug in the middle in a weird way.
Yeah, this is something we're going to want to chat through a little bit more. But this also comes back, I think, to the bistable images, where you just pop from the one version to the other. So it's as if you've got these two sort of separate hierarchies.
Yeah, hierarchies or something.
Created these two different interpretations, and the two interpretations aren't really talking with one another so much, but again, the phenomenal experience is flipping back and forth between them. They're both drawing on lower levels, but integrating them into different gestalts.
It's like there's two different shaped attractor basins, and you've dynamics, and you're flipping between the two.
Exactly.
And the perception goes along for the ride. There's one other thing which occurred to me in this discussion that might be worth thinking, and that is the idea of circular causality. In my own musings in my book, I've structured a conception of matter generally in terms of circular causality, nested hierarchy of circular causality, where layers interact up and down simultaneously with the next layer up and themselves. And the whole thing is circular at all levels. So that to keep that whole structure going, it requires the coherence that you're talking about. But at certain moments, the whole thing can synchronize. And if you have circular causality, which is kind of like typical neuron wiring, reciprocating or reciprocal connections are perfectly suited to that very thing, both across the cortex and thalamocortically. So circular causality might be a way of characterizing this in a way that you haven't fully explored. So I thought I'd mention that.
Yeah, I'll think more on that. Yeah, I think I need to contemplate this more, because I'm not going to give up on coherence as being interesting in some way.
Don't give up on coherence.
I'm not going to give up on coherence. There's got to be like a magical, mind-blowing moment in there somewhere. But
Well,
okay, for the sake of time, what?
let me riff off Colin's comment real quick, and
Yeah.
there's a comment, also a question for Colin. Thanks for bringing up the idea of attractor functions and mathematical functions, Colin, because I think maybe something here that you could flesh out, Justin and Jonathan, would be perhaps unique, is look at the possibility of common attractor forms across levels. And it's of course the GRT very well too, for conjecture 3 and GRT, where I suspect you might see similar kinds of attractor functions across levels, and you could probably characterize them mathematically quite precisely. I don't know what that looks like. I'm not a mathematician, but I wonder, Colin, if you do in your book kind of fleshed out that mathematics at all.
No, I had enough to do without the maths, but it generalizes it in terms of electromagnetism for sure. So there's a Maxwellian version of this brewing away in the background that I'm intent on exploring empirically first, and then someone smarter than me can sort out the maths. Okay.
Stephen, I nominate Stephen.
Poor Stephen.
Just a heads up, I'm
Alrighty.
gonna have to go pretty soon here, because I promised I want to be ready for the.
Yeah, no, that's good. I'll just breeze to the end. I feel like the actual hierarchy part is probably the stuff we're all just like most familiar with when it comes to this anyway. So yeah, we can breeze through it. But yeah, the final principle is cross-frequency coupling. This is really like the nested nature. Neurons within a hippocampus will exhibit, for example, theta gamma phase amplitude coupling. Seems to be a mechanism for building and building and growing abstract information, which I'll come back to in a second. And a lot of my personal work has really been looking at these like two separate primary frequency pathways for bottom up and top down information. So the pitch here is that, information flowing from the smaller, faster observer windows to the slower ones typically takes the form of theta gamma coupling. And this is where we like build abstraction. The example is the rat running through the maze. We take a bunch of places, we bind them into not just a more complex place, but into a trajectory of motion. So through the sequencing or the ordering of information, we can build abstraction. So as you move from lower down in the hierarchy to the higher levels, you're synthesizing, organizing this information. And then we, at the higher levels, we get this, fully formed emergent abstract gestalt that has a lot of rich detail, but it also has this simplicity of being sort of like a cartoon-like abstract synthesis of all this information. And then similarly, in decision making, I'm like a big advocate of free will. So I believe there's got to be some way to have downward causality in the brain. And some of my research has been finding delta beta coupling, which is another sort of coupled frequency pair, where a particular motor cortex is coupling with prefrontal. And you see in the decision making process, when you're organizing and executing behaviors, you see this pattern of coupling. And yeah, I presented this like last time I gave a talk here, but yeah, I got a couple of papers looking at cross-frequency coupling in these two different major top-down, bottom-up frequency bands. I'm gonna breeze through, like, we all love fractals, and fractals repeat. And we pitch in the now model that there's sort of these fixed levels where you find observer windows, and it's not necessarily like a continuum of observer windows at arbitrary or infinite levels, but there's this notion in fractals called the Hurst exponent, where if you start zooming, you'll see that pattern emerge again. But it's not just the same pattern infinitely. It's that you zoom, there's the pattern, zoom, there's the pattern again, zoom some more, there's the pattern again. And so like a true representation of fractal mathematics, we might find that observer windows are only occurring at fixed levels, and there's biological infrastructure at play to create observer windows at these fixed scales, but it's not that they can just be arbitrarily assigned to like any biological structure. All right, so then big picture, this kind of explains, this bottom-up emergence process and this top-down submergence process where information can build an abstraction going up and then action plans can get submerged downwards. And we operate at this very slow frequency. We can't even kill flies, they're too fast for us, but we have rich experience and simple decision-making that enables a lot of the higher order intelligence that we have. But yeah, maybe some slight limitations like not being able to kill flies. And then I really love this idea that we have sort of limited influence where even though we know this is an optical illusion on the left, we can't stop ourselves from seeing it. And I think this kind of gets back to like the duck rabbit flipping, but it's like, even if we're aware that something doesn't really represent like veridical true reality, we still can't help but see it. There's still information being like pumped in this bottom up direction, and it doesn't matter our intention at some level. And then also I think a really interesting phenomenon neurologically is the fastball in baseball, which is sort of this classic example of it doesn't seem humanly possible for someone to hit a fastball, and yet people do it all the time. And so, to what degree are we able to influence our body, and at what level is it really sort of enacting its own action plans? And I definitely think we have control over our bodies, but I wonder if we have like a limited influence typically where we're just kind of influencing one level beneath us and one level above us. And then that is the level of our control. We're not aware of all the muscle movements in our bodies, and yet we can initiate these like big picture complex behaviors, right? But you don't really understand all the intricacies going into that. So like through this nesting, you can rely on these like semi-autonomous conscious beings down the hierarchy to sort of worry about the details on your behalf and then get that abstract input and then carry it out. I think that's pretty much the end, but then Daniel Dennett has this thing where if there's a little man in your head controlling your body, there must be a little man inside of his head controlling his body. And this is a huge problem of infinite regression of tinier and tinier conscious beings inside of your body, to which I say that's the solution. It's just infinite regression.
Great.
This isn't a problem at all. It's actually turtles all the way down. And
Yes.
thank you for your time. Yeah.
Awesome.
Excellent. Any final questions or comments before we call it a night?
I'm just going to say, Justin, take a look at that. So I was reading the paper and I realized that I had written a section anticipating future directions in consciousness back in 1984. And a number of these ideas, including your homunculus comment, is in that 1984 paper.
Nice.
So,
okay, yeah, we'll definitely have to cite that one.
the
Yeah.
more, just the end of it. It's mostly like Beth Loftus's stuff, but then I piggybacked this sort of part on the end. Yeah, it's like deja vu all over again. Great job. I got to run. Other folks are welcome to stay on, but I got a party to get to. See you guys.
Bye, Jonathan. Have fun.
Enjoy.
Thanks.
I have a question.
Yeah.
And it's about your last example with the baseball example. I think this is a really interesting problem of like, how do you hit the baseball? And because my sense is that we have this idea of like the observer window and like the refresh rate. And I feel like there's a tendency to all too easily treat those things as too static, when they're much more dynamic and they seem to be tuned to what you're anticipating. Because the way the batter is able to hit the baseball, like if you treat it as this static thing where it's like, oh, he has less than half a second to react. And like in any scenario, you're not going to react with less than half a second. But in baseball, you're sitting there, the batter is tuned to the pitcher.
You're primed. Yeah.
And he's already synchronized up. And like, I don't know if you have played baseball or tennis or anything, any kind of sport that's like this, but it's like,
No, I'm a fraud. I'm a fraud. But yeah.
well, there's this thing that happens all too occasionally where you know that you've got it. Like, you know that you know that you're going to hit it before he even throws the ball. And it's something about, you're just like locked in, you're synced up, you're locked in, and you know you're tuned in. And in baseball, like, that's what's going on when guys get hot. And then when they go cold, they're out of sync, they're out of tune, they can't get their timing right. And it's really this incredible process, because they're adjusting these micro movements that are at like the millisecond scale, but the body mind system is able to have this sensitivity to it, right? And I really wonder, and this kind of goes back to my earlier comment about the kind of like vertical dimension, like, because I wonder about how that, what the mechanics are of how that happens, how you have this large scale whole body mind system that can sort of zoom all the way down to these micro movements and these micro adjustments to also be tuned, you know, in time, and like anticipate that tiny little window where everything has to line up.
Yeah, like in a weird way, it's definitely not like, oh, it's autonomous, I just kind of like float around there and then I hit the ball, right? It's like they are definitely like tapping into the hierarchy and paying a lot of attention to yeah, little body muscles that they wouldn't normally. But yeah, but even within that example of like they're tuning themselves and they're like putting in all this volitional control, you know, at what level is it like also, you know, beyond yourself, where there's like these sub processes that are really tuning into this other person, you know, or like synchronizing or becoming coherent with the picture, like, can we ever even be aware of all the levels of engagement, you know?
Yeah, no, I mean, it definitely kind of feels like that.
Yeah.
But I'm also thinking on, like, you know, just in terms of the oscillations, like it's like there's these large oscillations, and I mean, this kind of applies to anything when you have to kind of amp yourself up for it for like some really intense moment, you know, where you can feel this kind of internal rhythm in yourself, and it's like you're kind of getting all your resources lined up so that you can do the thing, like so that you can jump off the cliff or you know, hit the ball or throw it or something like that. And I mean, it feels to me like it's this enormous cross frequency coupling that happens at, you know, not just two scales, but like an enormity
like a
of
lot
scales,
of scales,
you know. Yeah, a huge hierarchy of scales.
I remember Nadal preparing for a serve.
Right.
That those moments where he goes through this stereotypical pattern with the same number of bounces of the ball, and he touches the side of his head, and he leans forward and back, does all of this stuff. And I can imagine the hierarchy being sort of coherencized, or whatever you want to call it, cohered by all this bodily activity for the moment of preparation. And it's the same kind of thing.
Exactly.
That's cool. Yeah, like some like mental ritual to like relinquish control of your of your observer window or something.
Yeah.
But if it's that there's a real mechanics going on there.
Yeah. And I mean, there's some parallels here to Zen teachings, where the key for achieving, you know, high attainment is to get out of the way of your body. And in the now model, or GRT model, and its parallels would be simply letting the appropriate level of awareness of consciousness do the work, and not let your higher conscious mind interfere with those processes.
Yeah.
And the other thing I was going to comment on is just the delta beta coupling is really interesting in the context of free will. I assume you're looking at like Leibotz's experiment with the, the arm moves and then you're consciously aware that it's moving and you can veto.
And you can veto it. Yeah, I just like got his book Mind Time, and
I think that's
it got
great.
delivered today, but I already was on the plane. Bummer.
Nice. And I personally feel like raising your consciousness is basically like increasing your ability to veto. Yeah. So anyway.
Yeah, I mean, William James has this theory that the only thing we've ever done in our lives is attend to something and like expand it, or we suppress something. And that we really just have like a binary decision in our minds to like sustain and cultivate, or to annihilate or get rid. And that like, yeah, like any situation you go into, are you just letting your body spring a bunch of ideas into your mind, and then you're like choosing the one that like resonates with you in that moment? I mean, I don't know, I really just wonder like how much of our lives is like this volitional multiple choice of like attend or not to attend, and we attribute so much more to ourselves. I mean, and that is a really important act, right? To like attend to something or not, like you are creating a lot by like choosing a process to proliferate, but are we really doing more than that in a way? I don't know.
I in a sort of an altered state situation, I was seeing this as like the signal comes down from the non-local field or whatever, and it's almost like a Google auto suggest on what you're supposed to do. And then I think, as you raise your consciousness, there are nuances to what you're able to shift within that, like Google auto suggest. So yeah.
Ooh, I love that. Yeah, I think these like altered states, or like the psychedelic state where you really come in contact with how much you're really in control of what's happening,
Yeah, for sure.
We definitely have to, I believe in free will for sure. I think we're really here, but
Cool. Well, thanks so much, Justin. Let's cut it off there, and you had the free will to now take the rest of the day off.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much for watching. Don't forget to like this video, share it with your friends and colleagues, add a comment, and subscribe to the General Resonance Theory YouTube channel. We'll see you next time.